Good morning everyone, and welcome to the videos for CISSP security. In this video, we will discuss what the CISSP is all about, the different domains that are covered in the CISSP course, what exactly do we mean by information security. Then we are going to have a discussion on vulnerabilities, threat, and risk. We are going to describe each and every term, and we are going to see how they are related to each other, after which we'll tie that up with discussing risk management, and we'll then identify the roles and responsibilities of the management in the information security space. So let's begin with the first topic of this video. What is CISSP? Now, the CISSP stands for the Certified Information Systems Security Professional. This is a gold standard in information security as far as certifications are concerned, and is normally gained by professionals with experience of more than 5 to 10 years and is more of a management related certification. This certification ensures that you have the requisite knowledge to become an information assurance professional, where you can implement security in an organization and an enterprise on an enterprise scale. For the exam, there are two ways to go about with the exam. Anyone can attempt the exam, but once you clear the exam, there is a verification that takes place from the ISC², which is the certification authority for CISSP, where you have to prove that you have at least 5 years of experience in the information security field in at least 2 of the domains that are specified under CISSP. If you do not have that experience, you can still get certified as an associate of ISC², and then they give you 6 years to complete the relevant experience that is required, after which you become a CISSP certified professional. The exam is quite difficult. It's known as a mile wide, inch deep exam, because you don't have to be a master in each and every domain, but you have to understand and have the knowledge across all these domains that are specified. The exam is quite tough, and people take a long time to ready themselves for these exams. The passing rate for the candidate in the very first attempt is well below 50%. Now, this should not be taken as a negative point. The reasons are plentiful, because there are people who actually do not realize the exam itself or do not realize the seriousness of the exams. People without experience, without reading the requisite books, think that it's just going to be a theoretical exam, and thus they try to attempt it without being ready for it, right? When you want to take the exam, people study for months together, and they solve a lot of question banks, ensure that they have the prerequisite knowledge. So they read a lot of books that are out there. Some of them are prescribed by ISC² themselves. Others are from different authors that they try to give in more insight to certain topics. And then once they feel that they're ready, they would give the exam. I've seen people take question banks of at least 2,000 to 3,000 questions, ensure that they're scoring at least 80% in those test exams, and then attempt the exam itself. So in CISSP, as with every security course, we start off with the CIA triad. Now here, CIA is confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So it starts off with every security mechanism. When we talk about security and we want to keep things secure, what is it that we want to secure? It is the data of an organization that is the most valuable asset to the organization, and that's what we want to secure. When we say that we want the data to be secured, we basically talk about 3 aspects for that data. The first and the foremost, that the data needs to remain confidential. The second aspect, that the data needs to be trustworthy. And the third concept, that the data should be available to all authorized users when and where they require it. So going back to the first point, when we say we want data to be confidential, what do we mean by that? By confidentiality, we talk about that data being made available only to authorized users after you have authenticated them, ensured or assured of their authenticity, and only then you're going to give access to that data, right? So even if you go into an organization has a hierarchy of governance, right? So only certain people with certain clearances or certain job titles can have access to certain amount of data, whereas other people may not have access to it. For example, a person working in the sales department will not have access to data that is accessed by the HR department. Thus, that's what we are looking at: classification of data and keeping it confidential, only making it available to those people who require it. When we say trustworthiness or the integrity of that data, the integrity is where the data has been altered, modified, removed, deleted by unauthorized people. So we want to prevent that, which means when we say we want the integrity intact, we want to ensure that only authorized people can modify, alter, or remove data if they are allowed to do so. So that's where the authorization and authentication comes into the picture again. And data needs to be available. For me to safeguard data, I can just lock it up in a safe, throw the safe in the depth of an ocean, and say that the data is secure because it cannot be leaked out. but that data is no longer available to authorized users, hence that data is useless. For me, data would have value when the data remains confidential, has its trustworthiness intact, and is still available to all the users that are authorized to access it. So when we talk about security, we want these three aspects to be implemented on any and every digital asset that the organization has and does. Once these 3 points are guaranteed or at least assured to a certain extent, we can then say that the data or that particular asset is secured. So when we talk about CISSP, what are the domains in CISSP as far as the exam and the certification is concerned, and how is CIA or information security related to it? So to start off with, there are 8 domains in CISSP. One starts off with asset security, then you've got security architecture and engineering, then we have communication and network security, identity and access management, security operations, security assessment and testing, software development security, and security and risk management. Alright, so talking about the 8 domains, the first one being security and risk management. This is from a governance perspective where we talk about the risk an organization would face, risk management a little bit, talk about compliance, laws, regulations that the organization has to look forward to or needs to adhere to. So if you look at an organization's, from an organization's perspective, you are looking at a business objective that an organization has and how security can be aligned with the business objectives. For example, if you take an online retailer, or as we call them an e-tailer, and we want to look at how security is relevant to them, right? We first want to look at what are the compliances or what are the laws the country has in which they exist, and what laws do they need to adhere to. Could be corporate laws, could be computing laws, could be the Information Technology Act that we have in India, or the privacy acts that we have across the world, GDPR if that is required, regulations. For example, a financial organization would need to comply with GDPR if they are in Europe, or if they're in USA, California, there's a California Act that's there for privacy. The security that they want to deal with, so if they want to implement ISO 27001 on top of that, what are the requirements for ISO 27000? What is the scope of that standard that can be implemented in their organization? So they want to check on these laws, regulations, compliances, and they need to check which they need to implement and which they need to adhere to. And once they have identified that, they would look at the risk assessment. They would see where they are positioned right now, what are the risks that the organization faces as far as these laws, regulations, and compliances are concerned, how they can mitigate those risks with security, and once security has been implemented, how they can move on with the governance of that enterprise over a longer period of time. And then this is broken down into rest of the modules where you can first talk about asset security. So you first want to identify the assets of an organization. Could be physical assets like computers, servers, storage servers, switches, routers, see how they can be secured. Physical security comes into the picture as well. Then you want to look at digital assets like data that is being stored, classification of data maybe a little bit, where you have identified data, you have classified them as proprietary data, something that is trademarked, something that is copyrighted, etc. The value of those assets that the organization has towards them, and then how you're going to protect that asset based on the risk assessment strategy that you have identified in the first domain. Then comes with the third module, security engineering. Now this is where security by design starts as far as CISSP is concerned. CISSP always encourages security to be involved at each and every phase of the life cycle of an organization. So for example, the third domain will start off with enterprise architectures like TOGAF, and how security architectures like ISO 27001 or ISO 27002, 3, 4, 5 of any of these standards or COBITs, for example, can be implemented and integrated with the enterprise architecture, thus giving you a good security architecture right from the inception point. So the main aspect being security should not be bolted on, it should be secure by design, which means while you're creating it and implementing it, security should be implemented right from then. Then we move on to the next module, module 4, communications and network security. So in the previous module, you have identified the devices that you have talked about how the architecture of those devices would be, how data flows are going to happen, and then how you're going to secure those data flows. Then you come to the communication and networking part of it, how these computers or devices are going to interact with each other, which protocols are going to be utilized. The OSI layer comes into the picture, how you're going to secure yourself against various network-based attacks like ARP spoofing, MAC spoofing, IP address spoofing, sniffing attacks, man-in-the-middle attacks, and things like that. Now, this domain is slightly technical. It does talk about OSI layers, TCP and UDP, but it doesn't go in depth about technicalities about how attacks are created or how attacks are executed, right? So that's something that this training doesn't deal with. So this is not a hacking training where you're actually going to learn how to hack. It's basically an overview of what threats or risks a network or a communication protocol protocol may have, and thus you're going to identify the relevant security controls and implement them on those particular levels. So for example, in this mechanism, I want the OSI layer, which has 7 layers, right from the physical layer to the application layer, and then I want to identify a particular attack and which layer it affects, and thus want to have an appropriate security control to monitor that layer so as to mitigate that particular attack, right? So it's semi-technical, if you will, where you need to understand the OSI layer and the protocols, but you don't need to execute those attacks at all. Then comes the identity and access management. So if you've seen, if we go back to security and risk management, and we have talked about CIA, confidentiality, integrity, availability, and then we have talked about identifying assets, engineering with security as a design, networking, and all those. Now, when we come back to confidentiality and we want to keep these things confidential, how do we do that? The first thing is identity and access management. So who is allowed to access what, to what extent are they allowed, and what are they authorized to do? Are they allowed to modify those particular data points, delete, remove them, or add to them, edit them, etc.? So who's authorized to do what? And once they're authorized, you want the authentication mechanism to come in. So we come back to the IAAA standards: identification, authentication, authorization, and accountability. So when I say I want user who has been through the identity and access management process, and only then will they be allowed to access, that's where your user management comes into the picture. For example, let's take Gmail. Everybody accesses Gmail. What is it that you first do? You open up a browser. That's where your asset security comes in, the browser becoming that asset where you need to secure it. So you secure it by having anti-phishing toolbars, maybe an antivirus and things like that. The security engineering coming into the picture, where you have integrated a particular browser with some particular extensions, how the browser is going to communicate using HTTP, HTTPS, right? And then when you go to Google, you use the identity and access management module. So it first asks you to identify yourself by using your username. So you type in your email address, that's your identity. So that's the IAAA identity coming into the picture. Then it asks for authentication, which is your password. You may have enabled multi-factor authentication at that point in time. So once you put in the password, if it's single authentication mechanisms, you enter it, and then that's where your authentication process comes into the picture. After that is the authorization process. What are you authorized to access as a user? Do you get access to the entire Gmail server? No, you only get access to the email account that you have been authorized to access. Within that, if you're an administrator to that account, you can do whatever you want, and they are still monitored. That's where the accountability part comes into the picture, where if you do something illegal, you may be penalized for it. So that's the identity and access management module that comes into the picture. Now, with the browser, I've just given you a very basic example, but as you go into a larger scenario, we are looking at enterprises, and you're looking at security over different assets like storage, databases, and so on and so forth. It becomes a huge task to have an identity access management module implemented. Then comes the next domain called security operations. So that's where your day-to-day operations like a SOC, a security operations center, comes into the picture. So incident management, disaster recovery, your investigations, forensics of what attacks have happened. So your security operations centers might be the day-to-day activities that you deal with, let's say an IDS, IPS, firewalls, antiviruses, and it's basically a structure of how you're going to build an exercise to manage incidents as and when they happen. So it's basically more of a operation scenario where you're looking at the day-to-day health of an organization rather than looking at an overview of the security of an organization. Then comes security assessment and testing, which is basically your secure development lifecycle, or SDLCs as they are known, where you'll be looking at how you can assess applications, where you'll be looking at SAST, DAST, or dynamic application security testing, static application security testing, and so on and so forth. So here you're either procured an application from a third party and you want to test that application to see how it is going to, or what risks it is going to expose your business to, or you're developing an application and you want to involve security right from the inception. So if you're looking at that, then you can move on to the next domain where we talk about software development security, which talks about different software development lifecycle models like waterfall, agile, spiral models, and so on and so forth. So if you look at the 8 domains, they basically start off with the governance, where they talk about security and risk management, and they go to each and every aspect of your information technology and give you an overview of how security should be implemented right from the inception and build up from there to the execution level. Now the exam and these domains are built in a ideal world, not a real world scenario. So there are a few assumptions over here where you assume that you have all the required resources, you have all the required people to do those jobs, you're living in an ideal world, you've mapped all the roles and responsibilities properly, and then you're talking about these 8 domains. In the real world, things are quite different, and people who have got real world experience kind of struggle to map all those things as far as an ideal world is concerned. And that's where your reading and your understanding of these concepts come into the picture. Moving on, let's talk about information security. Information security is the process of protecting data and information systems. So in the CIA, as we talked about it, when we said what do we want to protect, we want to protect all the information assets or the technical assets that we have from any of the vulnerabilities that can be identified. So we want to restrict unauthorized access and use. We want to restrict deletion, accidental or intentional if they have not been authorized to do so, modification of data, so the integrity part, and destruction of data. Destruction could not only be deleting data, but it could be something like a ransomware where the data gets encrypted, so it's still there, it's just not accessible to you. Now, information security ensures the implementation of these following aspects. The first and foremost comes from information security policies, which is the governance aspect of it. The policies are designed to have a implementation of security in an organization that helps the business processes to be executed in a secure manner. Where are these policies coming from? They come from standards or guidelines which are globally available and based on which we can start developing our security policies. For example, if I want to develop a security policy in my organization, I might want to depend on frameworks like ISO 27001, COBIT, or something similar. Once I have these standards set, I would come back to procedures. Procedures being how are these standards to be executed, right? For example, in my policies, I ensured that I want encryption of AES 256 to be implemented, or rather in the policy, I determined that we want encryption to be implemented on a data set based on the classification of those data. So in my policies, I would determine how the classification is going to work, how data is going to be classified on what parameters, and thus once the data gets classified, we are going to come back to standards where we say if it is classified as confidential data, we want to use encryption to protect that data, and we want AES 256 to be utilized for encryption. So how do we go about it? How do we implement the encryption? That's where your procedures come into the picture. Your guidelines are troubleshooting mechanisms, optional documents. So if somebody has trouble following the procedures, they might want to go into the guidelines and see how to troubleshoot the scenario that they are facing. Baselines are basically the minimum achievable target that you want to go with these policies. So let's say when I say I want to have a baseline on a server where for the server to be published onto the internet or to be used in production environment, it has to meet a certain criteria, which means I can go back to the hardware and I can say the server needs a hardware configuration of X, Y, and Z. Let's say a Xeon processor with 16 cores, 128 gigs of RAM. So that's a baseline that I need for a particular server for it to be put into production environment for a particular use. Anything above that is acceptable, but nothing should go below that. Then comes the risk management. While we are implementing these policies, procedures, we have those standards in place. If we face any risk during that period, or if we face any threat or a vulnerability is identified during this period, all these terms we are going to discuss in a little bit. So when we identify vulnerabilities or threats, that's where our risks come into the picture. The risk management comes in saying, okay, this is a risk that we have identified, and now how do we want to mitigate the risk? Then the security organization comes into the picture, the day-to-day activity of how security is to be implemented. And for all of these procedures, policies, baselines, standards to be implemented, to be ensured that to be assured that they are working properly, we need to make our employees aware that these policies exist. This is something that they need to follow. Thus, the awareness or the security education comes into the picture. Here, the security education is more focused on helping employees adhere to the company policies and standards rather than educating employees about security. We don't want to make everybody an ethical hacker. We just want to ensure them or we want to assure the organization that everybody has been warned about policies, procedures, security requirements, and they are going to follow those requirements. For example, a password policy where you have to adhere to a specific password policy to ensure passwords are created. At the same time, there is another password policy which says that you should not share passwords with your colleagues no matter what. So for me, for my employees to follow that, I need to make them aware that these policies exist and there are repercussions if they do not follow these particular policies. So coming back to the governance part, what is governance since we have been talking about it? Governance ensures that the security strategies are aligned with business objectives and consistent with regulations. So what does it guarantee? Appropriate information security activities are being performed. Based on what? Based on the policies that we have created, based on the standards that we have and the baselines that we would have created. So security has to be comparable, right? So if I say I have secured against particular attacks, the attacks have to be identified, and then compared to those particular attacks, I can say I have mitigated these activities by having specific security controls. Thus, I can say that I am secure. The governance aspects keeps a watch on all these security controls to see that those security activities are ensured, are being implemented, and are performing to the best of their abilities. That's where your governance comes into the picture. The risks being reduced, so the risk management also comes under the governance, where you're looking at newly identified risks and you're then implementing security controls that would mitigate these risks. Then we are looking at information security investments appropriately directed. So when I say I want a security control, which would be a firewall, IDS, IPS, antiviruses, whatever is required, it needs to have a return on investment which is acceptable for the organization. You don't want to spend up too much of money in security, thus creating losses for the organization. When you say a business objective is always to make money rather than lose money. So security should be a supporting feature to the business objectives, where the services are being provided by the business in a secure manner in such a way that they can still have a positive return on investment on the services that are being provided. And the executive management can determine the program's effectiveness. This is the major part, because we have to, even in any compliances, audits, technical audits, we have to prove that whatever we have implemented actually works, is effective, thus mitigating the risk. If your security controls are not effective, then you have just wasted a bucket load of money and have not achieved any security measures in your exercise. Moving on to security controls. Security controls are measures taken to safeguard an information system from an attack, basically for the CIA triad, the confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So security controls could be administrative controls, technical controls, or physical security controls. What are administrative security controls? They would be policies, procedures that we have in place. So the password policy becomes an administrative control where the management has made everybody aware that the password needs to meet a particular complexity, should not be shared, and thus becomes an administrative security control. A technical security control would be where we are implementing this policy, and thus when I try to create a password, there is a software that maps the password to the complexity requirements, assures or ensures that the complexity requirements have been met, and thus allows the password to be accepted or rejects the password as the case may be. That is a security control. A physical security control may be, let's say, a CCTV camera which you're going to use to monitor people and ensure that nothing untoward happens. It's not only against physical crime, but let's say access to a particular room where nobody is seen tailgating. Maybe monitoring a server room which is very well secured and ensuring that unauthorized people do not get access or purposefully or intently do not access that area at all times. So these are the three levels of security controls that can be implemented to enhance the security of an organization. Then we come to security policies. Policies is an overall broad statement produced by a senior management that dictates the role of security within the organization. For example, the password policy that we talked about, it just said that it needs to meet a certain complexity, which is a broad statement that is being made by the management saying we want to adhere to this policy to ensure that we do not get hacked by brute force attacks or dictionary attacks or whatever it is. The broad statement is trying to prevent certain attacks from happening on the organization. How it is implemented, that's where the procedures and everything else comes into the picture. It must integrate security into all business processes. So if I start creating a policy which ensures that the complexity should be so high that the password should be at least 20 characters strong, that would be detrimental to the organization's health because people may not remember those passwords, or resetting those passwords, or having technical mechanisms, technical security controls in place to implement that kind of stringent security may be too expensive to have. So whatever policies are created, they need to be in in line with the business processes as well. The policy must be reviewed and modified periodically or as company changes. So as and when the company becomes more mature and can have more levels of security, they must look at their policies again and redefine them. Or as a company grows or changes market scenarios or changes business processes, these policies may become redundant. So you want to look at those policies and implement newer policies or modify the existing policies to suit the business processes in a better manner. It must support vision and mission of the organization. A business once established will always have a long-term vision. For example, the e-tailer example that we are talking about, for me to open an e-retailing website, I don't want it to be periodic. I don't want it to be for a month or something like that. I want to achieve success in that factor, and I want to create a plan of where I want to reach, let's say in the next 5 years. So how do I achieve that? That's something that I need to plan as a business plan. All my security mechanisms that are in place should be in alignment with the business plans, business visions across the number of years that we have envisaged the business to perform. So that's where the policies come into the picture. Policies are always long-term, not short-term documents, but need to be periodically reviewed and modified as the business grows or business changes its posture. Then looking at compliance. Compliance means conforming to a rule such as a specification, policy, standard, or law. So we have looked at compliance from a perspective where we talked about ISO 27001 or PCI DSS or those frameworks. Now these are not laws, but these are standards or frameworks that have been created over a period of time through experience. And these are targeted towards organizations, towards specific industries. For example, PCI DSS is only towards finance organizations where they have payment gateways in place. The ISO 27001 is a more generic policy which can be implemented by various organizations. HIPAA, Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, is an American act that talks about health-related data of its citizens. So these are compliances. These may not be laws, but you need to adhere to these to be effective and to be allowed to conduct business in that particular industry. Then we have Code of Ethics. Code of Ethics state safety of the Commonwealth, duty to our principles and to each other requires that we adhere and be seen to adhere to the highest ethical standards of behavior. Therefore, strict adherence to this code is a condition of certification. What are the ethics? Protect society, the Commonwealth and the infrastructure, act honorably, honestly, justly, responsibility and legally, prove diligent and competent service to the principles, advance and profession. Now, the Code of Ethics are codes created by ISC² for the CISSP professional, and you need to adhere to these codes. If they identify violation of these codes from any member, they would debar the member, strip them of the certification, and even blacklist them based on whatever ethics they have violated. So even before the exam, you have to go through the Code of Ethics. You have to accept the Code of Ethics. In the exam, you may get up to 5 to 6 questions just on Code of Ethics. Then comes the legal systems. That's where the law comes into the picture. Law could differ from country to country or from region to region, and thus, depending on which country you're in, you may need to be aware of those laws of those countries. As far as CISSP is concerned, ISC² is concerned, they are an American organization, so they would talk about mostly American laws and a few European laws or directives as well. So there are 3 different laws that we talk about: civil, common, and religious laws. Depends on the country, the culture of that particular country. The information security professional should understand the different legal systems followed internationally. So you also may come across the classification as civil law, criminal law, and law of torts. Civil law is basically a law where, let's say, a contract has been breached and it's not criminal in nature. You just want to sue an organization for breach of contract. Criminal law is where something criminal has happened under the particular act of that particular country, like let's say a murder or an attack that has happened, a physical attack, or something got stolen. And the third one was the law of torts, where it's more of a compensatory law where you can file a case, a civil suit, demand compensation in lieu of the wrongs that have happened to that particular organization or that individual. Then comes the personal security. The people inside the organization need access to data to complete their assigned work and hence have the potential to misuse these privileges. And thus, you should have personnel security as well. Now, when we talk about hiring practices for people, most of the organizations perform background checks, and we get confused why these background checks are being done. The background checks are essential to the health of the organization, where you are ensuring that the person is not a malicious person, has the prerequisite certifications or the qualifications, have never been debarred or have never been prosecuted, do not have a criminal background, thus preventing physical attacks on the organization. For example, a competitor may attempt to place in your organization a spy to gather information on the secrets of that organization and report it back to the competitor. A background check may reveal that this person was previously employed by a competitor, and thus you might want to verify that how that employment got terminated, when did it get terminated, or is this person misusing anything or misrepresenting any aspect of his or their life. Then you also need to get confidentiality agreements signed with them. For example, NDAs, non-disclosure agreements, data that is being shared with them, the ownership of that particular data, and what are the repercussions if that confidentiality is breached by that particular person. Conflict of interest agreements for positions handling competitive information. As you go higher up in the organization, you might come across contracts where it prohibits a particular person in engaging into the same activity with a competitor for a particular period of time. So if there is a conflict of interest when you're hiring a person where they have signed such a agreement with another competitor or another organization, you don't want to embroil yourself in a lawsuit where the other organization may sue you for hiring a person while they were still under that particular contract. So it's not only to look at the background of these people, but to safeguard the organization from any lawsuits or any violations of contract as well. Get the non-compete agreements for the positions in charge of unique corporate processes. That again goes on to say if you're going to leave the organization, you cannot start up a competing business similar to the organization's business, and so on and so forth. Now let's come back to the technical aspect and start talking about vulnerability, threats, and risk. Now, what is a vulnerability? It is nothing but a weakness in a system or a process, implies the absence of a countermeasure. Vulnerability is internal and is more easily managed. So it's basically a flaw or a misconfiguration or a design flaw or something like using defaults, username, passwords, configurations, where if that particular flaw is misused, it will lead into a security event on that particular device for that particular organization. So when we say a security event, it has to be detrimental in nature. So if somebody is using a weak password that can easily be cracked, that is a vulnerability where you have identified a weak password, and then you want to prevent that vulnerability by imposing a security control or a countermeasure. The security control here starts off with the policy of having a robust security policy where a password policy comes in that describes the complexity of a particular password. And then you talk about a technical countermeasure where you have implemented an identity and access management plan, which would ensure that the person creating that password adheres to the complexity of that particular policy. Then a threat. The threat is the possibility that the vulnerability might be exploited, which will result in loss. So if somebody has created a weak password and it has been allowed, that's a vulnerability which can be exploited by the usage of brute force attacks or dictionary-based attacks to crack passwords. If the password is cracked, somebody unauthorized may get access to that data, thus resulting in a loss for that organization. So the threat is the possibility of that particular vulnerability being exploited. And then comes the risk. The risk is basically the likelihood of that attack being happened. So I have a weak password. It can be exploited by a brute force or dictionary attack. The likelihood of that attack is what determines the risk level for me. Now the likelihood will always be hypothetical, but we don't want to run helter-skelter and we do not want to take the possibility to extreme. So that's where your business processes come into the picture. Your security policies come into the picture. Based on the business processes and the policies implemented, if I have a weak password, what would be the loss that I would face for that particular person? For example, a fresher coming into an organization, having a weak password, but having limited access to data would have a lesser risk because of the loss being lesser than a CEO of an organization using a weak password and thus getting exploited, because the CEO will have access to more proprietary data that if gets into the competitor's hand would lead in huge losses. Thus, the same risk of having a password cracked for a fresher will have a lesser loss, thus a lesser risk compared to the same risk to a CEO where the loss would be higher. So a threat could also be in multiple aspects. Threats could be natural, that means to fires, flooding, tornadoes, anything that is an act of God that can happen with minimal human interaction. Or the second threat would be man-made, where man is responsible for it, like theft, hacking, rioting, war, anything that is created by a man, or rather humans. And technical in nature could be software bugs where vulnerabilities are created, or server failures where something technical has gone wrong and you need a technical skilled person to come in and repair that particular aspect. Then the fourth one would be a supply system failure or a chain supply failure where you have dependencies. For example, any organization will have a dependency on an electricity service provider where they are providing electricity as a service which powers on the IT infrastructure. If the service provider fails and there is an electricity or a power cut, your systems are not going to work. Thus, you need a secondary mechanism to prevent that threat from being realized. Once we have identified these threats, we have identified these vulnerabilities, and we have identified the likelihood and the probability of that attack, that's where we come across the risk management exercise. Now, what is risk management? Risk management is a hypothetical exercise where we have identified a vulnerability, we have looked at the threat that it may have, and the likelihood of that threat being realized. Once we have identified the threat, the risk level, that's where the risk management comes into the picture. Reading from the slides, a core component of enterprise security program. Why? Because we need a baseline and we compare security to a baseline. For example, I've got a firewall that has been configured in a particular manner. Now, when I do a vulnerability assessment on the firewall, the vulnerability assessment gives me a report that states that some of the rules may now be redundant, thus allowing access to unauthorized users. This becomes a risk, or this becomes a threat. If this threat is identified by unauthorized people, they would then try to attack this firewall to gain access to that data which they are unauthorized to access, thus leading to losses for an organization. What is the likelihood of this happening? If the likelihood is high or low, that's what the risk management program is all about, right? And based on these risks, we implement security controls, we manage the security controls, and then we verify the security controls for future risks to coming into the picture. It must be defined, and it is always defined as an ongoing project, because risks will always change based on the businesses, based on the security controls that you have. This will give a guidance to an organization of how security is being implemented, how it has enhanced over a period of time, and how security mature that organization has become because of the risk assessment program. It also helps you to satisfy two aspects: due diligence and due care. What is due diligence? Due diligence is basically the research that organization does in identifying those risks and mitigating them. The due care is the actual part of mitigation where you have implemented a security control to mitigate the risk that you have identified. So if company is negligent, that means if the company doesn't have a risk management program, it is not going to be that security oriented, or the security is not going to be that great. Thus, the company may not comply to laws, regulations, and standards, thus causing them penalties, lawsuits, and other repercussions in the industry based on whatever they are doing. For risk management, we come to frameworks. The frameworks are used to categorize information systems so that we can identify threats or risks based on the classification. So these classification helps us determine the criticality and the sensitivity of information system, right? So what is the sensitivity and criticality? It basically gives us an understanding of the value of the asset that we have. So if you go back to domain 1, the asset value or the asset identification, asset security, that's where it comes into the picture. Obviously, a database server is going to be more secure than an end user laptop based on the data that they have. Thus, the criticality of the system for a database is much higher than an end user's laptop. Then we look at the security controls that can be implemented. Then for those, the frameworks like ISO 27001 comes into the picture. There is COBIT, there are a lot of frameworks out there, NIST 800-53. Then we talk about assessing the security controls. Once we have placed those security controls, we need to verify those controls are placed properly. They actually mitigate the risk and are appropriate to correctly mitigate that particular risk that they are created. Then looking at authorizing information systems, grant information systems operations based on risks determined. So you have identified risks, you have authorizing some of the devices to function in a particular manner based on which some of those risks would be mitigated or would be reduced to an acceptable level. So in the CISSP, we talk about a lot of risk assessment strategies. We look at how we can manage risks. The 4 different types of managing risks would be: one is to mitigate, other is to transfer, the third is to accept it, and the fourth one is to neglect the risk. So in the CISSP, it talks in great details about those risk assessment strategies. We are talking about the 4 types of risk mitigating strategies. They are risk avoiding or avoiding the risks, accepting the risk, transferring the risk, and limiting the risk. So in the course, we basically talk about a lot of risk strategies and how to mitigate these risks and how they can be implemented to bring down to a acceptable level. So again, risk acceptance, risk appetite of an organization comes into the picture. These terms are then discussed in the training to understand how the policies would work around the risk management strategy. Moving on, then looking at monitoring security controls. So once we have security controls in place, we have assessed them, we also need to monitor them for the effectiveness, and though they are going to create any alerts or any risks are being realized or any new risk that may be created by the security control implementation. So in these risk assessment, these are the frameworks, these are the steps that we want to follow to identify, mitigate, and monitor these risks. So the management begins with risk assessment. What do you mean by risk assessment? Identifying the impact of the risk that the risk would have on the organization. And there would be 2 different ways to assess the risk: a quantitative assessment or a qualitative assessment. A quantitative assessment is more quantifiable or is numerical in its process, where you're looking at assigning costs to particular assets and the threats. So the losses that you may figure out in a risk assessment strategy would be more numerical, where would be in a currency format, where let's say a risk, if realized, would lead to a loss of a X amount of dollars. That's where the quantitative analysis comes into the picture. The qualitative analysis would be quality of a service. So if a service is being affected because of a risk, what is the degradation of that service? To what aspect is it getting degraded? For example, internet that we use. If there is an internet outage or if there is a reduction in internet speed, right? So if I've got a 10 Mbps line and now because of some fault of the ISP, it gets reduced to 4 Mbps, I may not be able to conduct the business that I was doing on a 10 Mbps line. Thus the quality of that device has degraded. Thus it is a risk and it is causing me losses, right? So qualitative risk analysis would be more descriptive in nature rather than be numerical in nature. Most of the companies or organizations would follow a hybrid policy because it is not possible to have a quantitative risk analysis in each and every scenario. Newer organization which doesn't have much data to rely on, historical data of how threats have affected that particular organization, may go in for a qualitative one, and as they mature over time in the security practices, they may then turn over to a quantitative risk analysis or a hybrid risk analysis where they're using a combination of quantitative and qualitative both. Thus, the risk controls that we were talking about: risk acceptance, risk reduction, and risk assignment. There is risk avoidance as well. So there are 4 controls. The risk reduction is where you have implemented a security control based on which the risk has been reduced to a more acceptable level. Risk assignment is where you're also known as risk avoidance. That's where you're avoiding risk by outsourcing it. So talking about risk controls again, the 4 types being accept, avoid, transfer, and reduce. Risk acceptance is where the organization is willingly accepting the risk as the way it is because they don't want to deal with it right now. They might deal with it in the next iteration, or it is at an acceptable level and the company just wants to move on. Avoiding the risk is where you are going to try to not use the service where the risk exists. Thus, avoiding is where you have identified a particular service where the risk exists and now you're not using the service to avoid the risk altogether. Risk limitation or risk reduction would be where you are implementing a security control to mitigate the risk. And then risk transference is where risk assignment comes into the picture, where you are transferring it to a third party, like outsourcing it by using insurance to limit the risk. So for example, the threat is of a fire, the risk is high, but you cannot do anything about it. So you purchase insurance. So if the fire actually happens, you would still be reimbursed for the losses that you have faced. Coming back to countermeasures, we have discussed administrative countermeasures. These are policies, rules, regulations, laws, customs that a company needs to adhere to based on the industry that they are in. Then there are technical controls, software controls, anything that is technical in nature, IDS, IPS, firewalls, encryption, anything that is going to help you implement the CIA. And then physical, where you would look at locks on doors, security guards at fences, where they're preventing access to unauthorized people. Let's talk about roles and responsibilities of management. Now, as far as management is concerned, or the hierarchy is concerned, you can see on the screen there's a senior management, the security professional, data owner, custodian, and user. Now these are from exam perspective, from the certification perspective. Obviously the hierarchy in an organization would be slightly different, but here the senior management is the responsible party for the entire security mechanism, so they must drive the entire security program. So CISSP talks about a top-down approach where the senior management has realized the importance of security and is implementing at all levels within the organization. Thus, they are a part of it and they are supporting the security program. They define the tolerance of risk of how much risk is to be tolerated by an organization from a monetary perspective or the qualitative perspective as well, depending on the laws, legislations, regulations, compliances, and the contracts that the business has signed. They will rely on security professionals to manage the risk, but the exercise and the management process has to be defined by the senior management. Once the security team comes up with the countermeasures, the senior management either approves or disapproves them based on the return on investment of that countermeasure. The security professional assists with the development of policy documents, gives their inputs because they are the people who are in the day-to-day process of dealing with these. Thus, they can identify gaps and give good inputs to modify or to create the policy in a more robust manner. The security professionals may be a part of the risk assessment and risk management team as well, especially the security technical aspects of it, assist with the implementation and maintenance of countermeasures. So the administrative, technical, or physical measures that you have identified, you may be requested to implement that. For example, the locks that we have on the door, the swipe locks, they are connected to a database where the database is maintained. So as a security professional, you wouldn't be responsible to fit those locks, but to create the database, manage and maintain the database where that information is kept upon, where people are authorized and authenticated, and would be responsible for monitoring, auditing, and security assessments as well. The data owner, the owner of that particular data part, would normally be the head of the department. For example, the sales data is normally owned by the director of sales of that department, so that they would be ultimately responsible for identifying that data, classifying that data, and accepting the security controls that are implemented. They may request for additional security controls if they deem fit. The security professional implements these security controls. Then the custodian, a person who is responsible for implementing the approved security controls or managing the day-to-day activity of the security controls. For example, the security professional has identified an access control to be implemented on a data set that the data owner owns. The data owner has approved of it. It is the custodian who is going to implement that strategy or implement the control on it. The user is basically the user who or the person who accesses the information and IT resources. Thus, whatever access controls have been implemented would identify the user, authenticate, authorize them, and hold them accountable for whatever they are doing. If the user is unable to authenticate, access would be denied. And that's it for this video. I appreciate you watching the entire video, and I'll see you in the next. Thank you.
Hi there, if you like this video, subscribe to the Simplilearn YouTube channel and click here to watch similar videos. To nerd up and get certified, click here.